Forget what you've seen in movies. Forget the elegant statues of lithe, thoughtful young men gazing adoringly at bearded philosophers. Erase the image of Plato's symposium, that sanitized, high-minded TED Talk on love, where everyone is witty and the only thing being penetrated is a complex philosophical argument. That's the highlight reel, the glossy brochure for a vacation package to a place that never existed. We've been sold a bill of goods, a historical lie so pervasive that we've mistaken it for poetry. We've romanticized ancient Greek love, particularly the bond between an older man and an adolescent boy, the Erastes and the Eromenos, as something pure, educational, a noble mentorship of the soul. It's a beautiful thought, isn't it? The seasoned citizen guiding the blossoming youth toward intellectual and civic virtue. Sound romantic? It wasn't. It was a market, plain and simple. A grimy, terrifying, and deeply transactional meat market where the commodities were youth, status, and power. The currency wasn't just admiration, it was shame, obligation, and the silent, choking fear of social annihilation. The Greeks didn't invent platonic love. They invented the world's most philosophically complex justification for statutory rape. They wrapped it in poetry and civic duty, but at its core it was about as romantic as a back-alley business deal, a grim negotiation conducted between a powerful man and a boy's ambitious father, with the boy himself serving as little more than the living, breathing contract. Tonight we're not reading the poetry, we're pulling back the toga to look at the grime underneath. We're going to explore the world where a boy's future depended on how gracefully he could submit, where love was a ladder and every rung was slick with sweat and hypocrisy. We're all perverts here, right? We're curious about the filth of the past because it helps us understand the filth of our present. This isn't a history lesson for the faint of heart. It's a deep dive into the anatomical, emotional, and social horror of a system designed to chew up beauty and spit out compliant, traumatized citizens. Imagine being a 13-year-old boy in Athens, your body just starting to betray you with the first signs of manhood. You're told your greatest asset isn't your mind or your strength, but the fleeting, perfect smoothness of your skin and the precise degree of non-consent you can project. Your father, the man who should be protecting you, is instead parading you through the agora like a prized calf, assessing the bidders. He's not looking for a mentor. He's looking for an investor. A powerful Erastes is a ticket to the big leagues. Political connections, a good military commission, maybe even a favorable marriage contract for your sister. Your body is the key that unlocks the family's future. The pressure is immense. You are expected to be alluring but not eager, submissive but not common, resistant but not insulting. It's a psychological tightrope walk over a pit of social ruin, and you're performing it naked for an audience of leering, wine-drunk men who are debating your merits as if you were a piece of pottery. They praise your budding virtue while mentally undressing you. They discuss the importance of guiding your soul while their eyes linger on your thighs. This entire charade, this elaborate dance of feigned reluctance and calculated pursuit, was the foundation of what they called a noble tradition. It was a performance, a city-wide stage play where everyone knew their lines, but no one dared to speak the subtext aloud, that this was about lust, power, and the consolidation of wealth within an elite circle of men. The boy was the initiation fee. His humiliation was the price of admission into the ruling class. So let's leave the marble halls of philosophy behind and step into the smoky, stinking reality of the Greek symposium, where the air was thick with cheap wine, expensive perfume, and the unspoken terror of 1,000 silent transactions. This is history with the safety off. But before we bow to our historical overlords, I need to know who's in my little army of degenerates. Sound off in the comments. What patch of earth are you on, and what's the time on your sundial? Let me know who's ready to watch the powerful get filthy. All right, let's bend the knee. For now, the grand romanticized encounter didn't just happen. It was preceded by a series of meticulous, often humiliating rituals of preparation, a pre-game show of anxiety and artifice for both parties. Let's start with the Irastes, our esteemed lover and mentor. Picture him, a man of 40, maybe 50, his gut straining against the finely woven linen of his chiton mai. He's not some chiseled god from the friezes. He's a merchant or a politician whose primary form of exercise is gesturing angrily in the assembly. His glory days on the wrestling fields are a distant, hazy memory, now replaced by the soft paunch of a man who enjoys his figs soaked in honey. He stands before a polished bronze mirror, a blurry, warped reflection staring back at him, and he begins the arduous process of constructing a plausible illusion of virility. His slave, a sullen Scythian captured in some forgotten border skirmish, stands by with the tools of the trade. First comes the oil. Not just any oil, but fine olive oil, infused with lavender or rose, a fragrant slick meant to mask the smell of stale sweat and mortality. The slave works it into his master's sagging flesh, his calloused hands moving with practiced indifference over skin that has seen too many banquets and not enough sun. The oil is supposed to evoke the gymnasium, the arena of youthful, athletic bodies. On this middle-aged man, it just looks greasy, a desperate attempt to shine up a tarnished vessel. He inspects his thinning hair, perhaps using a concoction of myrrh and pig fat to try and coax it into a more commanding arrangement. He plucks the stray grey hairs from his beard, each one a tiny betrayal, a testament to the time that is relentlessly slipping away. This is the man who will posture as a font of wisdom and virtue. This is the man who believes his worldly experience gives him the right to shape a young soul. But in this moment, in the dim light of his chamber, he is just an aging, insecure man, terrified that the boy will see him not as a mentor, but as a predator. His anxiety is palpable. He rehearses his opening lines, little snippets of Homer or a verse from a fashionable poet, hoping they will sound profound and not like the desperate ramblings of a man trying too hard. He worries about his performance, not just the physical act, but the entire theatrical production. Will the boy be suitably impressed by his rhetoric? Will he laugh at the right jokes? Will he display the correct amount of maidenly blush and token resistance? The entire affair is a delicate ecosystem of egos, and a single misstep could lead to mockery in the agora the next day. He thinks about the gifts. The negotiation with the boy's father was explicit. A fine cloak for the winter, a place secured in the cavalry, a handsome fighting cock for the boy to show off to his friends. These are not tokens of affection, they are installment payments. The Erastes is not just seducing a boy, he is fulfilling a contract, and the pressure to deliver on his end of the bargain is immense. His reputation is on the line. A failure to uphold his duties as a patron would be a social disaster, far worse than any private embarrassment. He is trapped in the same system he perpetuates, a prisoner of the very status he seeks to enhance. And what about the other side of this transaction? Let's shift our gaze to the Eromenos, our beautiful budding youth. He's 14. He is not preparing for a romantic tryst. He is being prepared for a sacrifice. His preparation is not a solitary act of vanity. It is a family project managed with the grim efficiency of a butcher preparing a prize cut of meat. His father, the Kyrios, the absolute master of the household, oversees the process. He gives his son a final inspection, his eyes cold and appraising. He's not looking at his child, he's looking at an asset, a living, breathing investment portfolio. He checks the boy's skin for any blemishes, any unsightly pimples or scratches that might lower his market value. He orders a slave to shave the boy's cheeks, a delicate, terrifying process involving a sharp, bronze blade and no shaving cream. The goal is to erase any hint of encroaching manhood. The first shadow of a beard is the death knell for an eromenos. It signals the end of his desirability, the closing of his window of opportunity. So the blade scrapes across his tender skin, leaving it raw and red, a prelude to the violations to come. The boy is bathed, scrubbed, and oiled, not for his own comfort, but to make him more appealing to the buyer. He is dressed in a simple, clean chiton that is designed to hint at the body beneath without being vulgar. It's all about creating an aura of innocent, untouched purity, a blank canvas upon which the Erastes can project his philosophical and carnal fantasies. While the Erastes rehearses poetry, the Eromenos is being coached on the art of strategic submission. His father's instructions are a masterclass in psychological manipulation. "Do not seem too eager," he'll say, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Let him pursue you. Remember, the virtue is in the yielding, not the wanting. When he compliments your mind, look down as if humbled. When he touches your arm, pull away, but not too quickly. You are not a whore from the Piraeus. You are a freeborn son of Athens, and your favor is a gift, not a commodity." The boy listens, his heart a cold, tight knot in his chest. He is being taught to monetize his own reluctance, to perform a version of chastity that is ultimately designed to be breached. He learns that his no is not a boundary but a part of the courtship dance, a scripted line in a play he never auditioned for. He feels a profound sense of dislocation, as if his body is no longer his own. It is a tool, a piece of family property being leveraged for social gain. He looks at his own hands, his own legs, and sees them through the eyes of others, the appraising gaze of his father, the hungry stare of his impending mentor. His internal world is a storm of confusion and dread. He has been told this is an honor, a crucial step on the path to becoming a good man, a respected citizen. But it feels like shame. It feels like being fattened for the kill. He catches his reflection in a water basin and sees a stranger, a painted, perfumed doll, his eyes wide with a terror he is not allowed to voice. He is being prepared not for a relationship, but for a ritual of public subjugation, and the silence in the room is filled with the weight of everything that cannot be said. The entire pre-ritual is a symphony of bad faith, a meticulously choreographed lie. The older man pretends he is driven by a noble desire to educate while privately consumed by lust and status anxiety. The boy pretends he is a reluctant vessel of virtue while privately being groomed for a transaction he is powerless to refuse. And the father pretends he is securing his son's future while actively pimping him out for a foothold in the slippery game of Athenian politics. It's a dirty, sordid business, and the perfume and poetry are just there to mask the stench of hypocrisy. This wasn't an exception, it was the system, a system built on a foundation of ritualized dread and sanctioned exploitation, all before the first cup of wine was even poured. The foundation was laid, the actors coached. Now let's talk about the stage itself. The environment where this grim theater unfolded was just as crucial and just as squalid as the preparations. Forget the pristine, sun-drenched marble porticos of your imagination. The typical setting for this noble mentorship was the undron, the men's quarters of a wealthy Athenian house, the designated zone for the symposium, and it was, to put it mildly, a cesspit of calculated filth. Let's build the scene from the ground up. The floor might be a beautiful mosaic, a sign of the host's wealth, depicting some heroic battle or a mythological orgy. But by the middle of the night, that intricate artwork would be slick with spilled wine, discarded olive pits and gobs of spit. Wealthy Athenians didn't just get drunk, they performed their drunkenness, and part of that performance involved a game called kottabos. which essentially amounted to flinging the dregs of your wine at a target, usually a metal disc balanced on a stand. The resulting spray and splatter coated everything: the floors, the walls, the furniture, and occasionally an unlucky slave. The air itself was a thick, breathing entity. The primary source of light came from flickering olive oil lamps, which cast long, dancing shadows and filled the room with a greasy, sooty smoke. This smoke mingled with the heavy, cloying scent of the perfumes worn by the guests, the sharp tang of the cheap, watered-down wine, and the unmistakable smell of sweating male bodies crammed into a poorly ventilated space. Add to that the aroma of cooked meat, garlic, and whatever half-eaten food was left to fester on the tables, and you have an atmosphere that was less philosophical salon and more frat house dumpster. It was an assault on the senses, a rank soup of sweat, smoke, and booze that would cling to your clothes and hair for days. The centerpiece of the andron was the set of klini, the dining couches. These weren't plush, comfortable sofas. They were hard, backless wooden frames, sometimes inlaid with ivory or bronze for a touch of class, but topped with lumpy, straw-stuffed cushions. These cushions bore the ghostly imprints and stains of 1,000 previous parties. They smelled of stale wine, body odor, and something vaguely like regret. 2 or 3 men would recline on each couch, propped up on one elbow, their bodies uncomfortably close, their shared space shrinking as the night wore on. This forced intimacy was part of the design, breaking down personal boundaries and making the inevitable physical advances feel less like a transgression and more like an inevitability. Now let's talk about the tools of the trade, because this wasn't just about bodies and couches. The objects in the room were active participants in this drama of power. The wine, for instance, was rarely served neat. It was mixed with water in a large, ornate crater, a massive ceramic bowl that served as the room's social hearth. A slave, the oinahus, or wine pourer, would be in charge of the mixture. The ratio of wine to water was a delicate calculation, a way for the host to control the mood. Too little wine, and the party was dull. Too much, and the guests might become genuinely drunk and violent rather than performatively boisterous. The wine itself was often rough, tasting more of resin and vinegar than fruit, a far cry from the fine vintages we might imagine. It was a functional beverage designed to loosen tongues and inhibitions just enough to facilitate the business at hand. The cups, or kai-likes, were shallow, wide bowls, often decorated with scenes that mirrored the night's activities. You might find yourself drinking from a cup painted with a graphic depiction of Heracles brawling with a centaur, or perhaps a satyr chasing a nymph. The most pointed and popular decorations, however, were scenes of courtship between an Erastes and an Eromenos. Imagine being the boy forced to drink from a cup that illustrates the very act you are expected to perform later. It's a piece of psychological warfare, a constant silent reminder of your role. The cup tells you this is normal, this is expected, this is what men do. It's a tool of normalization, turning a deeply personal and often traumatic experience into a piece of decorative art. And then there were the other props. Musicians, usually female slaves or hired courtesans, hetairae, would play the aulos, a double reed pipe that produced a shrill, piercing sound, adding to the cacophony. Dancers might perform, their movements a more overt and commercial version of the seduction happening on the couches. These women were a crucial part of the environment, serving as both entertainment and a kind of social smokescreen. Their presence allowed the men to pretend that the primary erotic focus of the evening was on them, even as the real transactions were being negotiated with the boys. They were a convenient fiction, a way to maintain plausible deniability. The environment was a crucible designed to reinforce the power dynamics. The host controlled the light, the drink, the entertainment. The older men, the Erastai, occupied the comfortable spots on the couches, their bodies sprawling with an air of ownership. The boy, the Eromenos, was often seated in a less prominent position, perhaps on a stool or at the edge of a couch, a satellite in orbit around the centers of power. He was an observer, expected to be quiet and learn until the moment he was called upon to be the center of attention. The whole setup was a physical manifestation of the social order. The smoky, dim lighting created a sense of secrecy and permissiveness. The close quarters broke down physical autonomy. The decorated pottery normalized the exploitation. The background noise of music and chatter provided cover for the quiet, predatory conversations. It was a carefully constructed trap disguised as a party. It smelled of shame, it sounded like forced merriment, and it looked like a conspiracy. This was the temple where the religion of male dominance was practiced, and every sticky, wine-stained surface was a testament to its grimy, hypocritical faith. So we have the players and the stage. But who's the director? In this sordid drama, power wasn't held by a single individual, but was a diffuse, insidious force flowing through a network of people, institutions, and unwritten rules. The most obvious authority figure was, of course, the Erastes himself. He was the one with the money, the status, and the beard. The holy trinity of Athenian male power. He held the keys to the kingdom, or at least the keys to a respectable future for his young charge. His power was overt. He was the one who initiated the courtship, who set the terms, who decided the venue. At the symposium, he was the star of the show, the one whose pronouncements on politics or poetry were met with deferential nods. He wielded his authority with a blend of paternalistic condescension and barely concealed lust. He would frame his advances as lessons. A hand on the boy's knee was a lesson in composure. A whisper in his ear was a lesson in rhetoric. The eventual sexual consummation was the ultimate lesson in manly virtue, a concept so twisted and self-serving it would make a modern spin doctor blush. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. This was a man who would likely spend his days in the assembly delivering fiery speeches about law, order, and the sanctity of the Athenian family, only to spend his nights trying to get his hands on his neighbor's teenage son. He would praise the gods for the city's moral fiber while actively corroding it in a smoky back room. His power was built on this double standard. He could operate in this gray area of sexual morality because he, and men like him, wrote the rules. The law might technically forbid prostitution for citizens, but this was mentorship. This was different. This was noble. It was a lie they all agreed to believe because it benefited all of them. But the Erastes was not the only power player here. Let's not forget the boy's father, the Kyrios. In many ways, his authority was even more absolute and more terrifying. The Kyrios had legal and social dominion over his children. He was their manager, their agent, their owner. His decision to enter his son into this arrangement was not a suggestion, it was a command. The boy had no legal standing to refuse. To do so would be to defy the head of the household, an act of rebellion that was simply unthinkable. The father's hypocrisy was perhaps even more chilling than that of the Erastes. He was sacrificing his son's innocence on the altar of his own ambition. He would sit down with the prospective mentor not to vet his character or his teaching ability, but to haggle over the price. The negotiations were a sordid parody of a dowry negotiation. "What can you do for my boy?" was the central question, which really meant, "What can you do for my family?" The boy became a pawn in a game of dynastic chess, his body a bargaining chip. The father would then turn around and preach to his son about honor and duty, framing this exploitative contract as a sacred obligation. He was the pimp who styled himself as a patriarch, the dealer who claimed to be a guardian. Then there was the broader, more amorphous authority of the social code itself. This was the silent, invisible power that kept everyone in line. In the competitive, status-obsessed world of the Athenian elite, having a handsome, sought-after eromenos was a status symbol, like having a fine horse or a large estate. It signaled your taste, your influence, your ability to attract the best of the next generation. For a boy, being chosen by a prominent Erastes was, paradoxically, his only path to social relevance. To reject the system was to risk being labelled an outcast, an oddity. You could be seen as arrogant for thinking you were too good for the city's most distinguished men, or worse, as unmanly and strange. The pressure to conform was immense. Your peers were all doing it. The heroes of myth and history had all done it. Who were you to say no? This social code was a self-perpetuating machine. Boys who submitted to the system grew up to become men who perpetuated it, becoming Erastai themselves and seeking out the next generation of beautiful boys. It was a cycle of abuse, sanitized and institutionalized as a civic tradition. The trauma was passed down generation after generation, reframed as education. The ultimate authority, however, was the city-state, the polis itself. The laws surrounding these relationships were a masterpiece of intentional ambiguity. It was illegal for a citizen boy to be a prostitute, pornos, to sell his body for cash. That was a crime that could result in the loss of citizenship rights, atimia. But it was not illegal for him to grant his favor, charis, in exchange for gifts and mentorship. The distinction was razor-thin and almost entirely subjective. It all came down to appearances. Was the exchange transactional and crass, or was it framed within the lofty language of love, education, and virtue? As long as everyone played their part and mouthed the right platitudes, the law would look the other way. This legal loophole was the institutional foundation upon which the entire system was built. It allowed the elite to engage in what was effectively a form of high-class prostitution, while simultaneously condemning the lower-class version of the same act. It was a law designed not to protect boys, but to protect the reputations of powerful men. Power, in this world, was a greasy, multifaceted thing. It was the predatory gaze of the Erastes, the cold calculation of the Kyrios, the suffocating pressure of social expectation, and the deliberate blindness of the law. They all worked in concert, creating a cage of hypocrisy from which there was no easy escape. The boy was trapped in the center of this web, and every figure of authority in his life, from his father to his city's leaders, was complicit in his exploitation. They were all in on the scam, and his body was the price of their collective silence. Before the first clumsy grope in a wine-soaked room, before the transactional exchange of gifts for favor, there was a deeper, more complex landscape to navigate, the internal world of the participants. What did they actually believe? How did they justify this sordid business to themselves, to their gods, and to the nagging little voice in the back of their minds? This psychological terrain was a minefield of superstition, faith, and masterful self-deception. Let's start with the religious and superstitious beliefs that permeated every aspect of Greek life. The gods of Olympus were not distant, benevolent figures. They were capricious, vain, and intensely interested in the affairs of mortals, especially their sexual affairs. Zeus himself was the ultimate celestial predator, constantly transforming himself to chase down and assault nymphs, mortals, and even boys, like the beautiful Ganymede, whom he snatched up to be his personal cupbearer and bedwarmer on Olympus. This divine precedent was a powerful tool of justification for the Erastes. If the king of the gods could indulge his desires, why shouldn't a respectable Athenian citizen? The myths provided a kind of cosmic permission slip. However, the gods were also jealous and vengeful. There was a constant low-grade fear of divine retribution. A man had to be careful not to commit hubris, an act of arrogant overreach. Was pursuing a boy from a rival family an act of hubris? Was offering insultingly cheap gifts a slight that might anger Eros or Aphrodite? They performed small rituals to hedge their bets, a quick prayer before the symposium, a small offering left at a shrine, hoping to keep the gods on their side. For the boy, the religious landscape was even more terrifying. He was in a state of profound vulnerability. Was this act a sin that would stain his soul? Would it anger the gods and bring a curse upon his family? He might carry a small amulet, a little bronze phallus, or an apotropaic eye, meant to ward off evil spirits and bad luck. These were the flimsy shields of folk magic against the very real threat of exploitation. Then there was the realm of folk medicine, a bizarre and terrifying collection of beliefs about the body. The Greeks had a rudimentary understanding of biology, and their ideas about health, disease, and conception were a wild mix of keen observation and pure fantasy. They believed that health depended on the balance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An excess of any one humour could lead to illness or madness. A man's semen was believed to originate in the brain and travel down the spinal cord. It was a precious substance, a distillation of a man's life force. And Erastes might worry that spending too much of it on a boy would leave him weakened and effeminate. Conversely, there was a belief that a boy could benefit from receiving this vital fluid, that it could literally instill manliness and courage in him. This biological fantasy was a cornerstone of the mentorship justification. The Erastes wasn't just having sex. He was performing a kind of physical transfusion of virtue. "I am making you a man," he could tell the boy and himself with a straight face, believing on some level in this grotesque pseudo-scientific rationale. For the boy, the medical fears were more immediate. The threat of sexually transmitted diseases was very real, though they didn't understand the mechanisms of infection. They saw the sores, the discharges, the slow, ugly decay, and attributed it to divine punishment or a miasma, a kind of spiritual pollution. A boy might be forced to use crude and painful methods of cleansing after an encounter, perhaps a harsh douche of wine, vinegar, or some herbal concoction, believing it could wash away both the physical and spiritual filth. But the most powerful force at play was psychological justification, the intricate stories the participants told themselves to make their actions palatable. Let's crawl inside the mind of the Erastes. His internal monologue is a masterpiece of self-serving logic. "This is not lust," he tells himself as he watches the boy across the room. "This is an appreciation for beauty, for kalokagathia, the unity of the good and the beautiful. I am not exploiting him. I am honoring him. I am a sculptor, and he is a fine piece of marble. It is my duty to shape him into a masterpiece." He sees himself as a selfless educator, a patriot building the next generation of leaders. The sexual component is merely a physical expression of this profound spiritual bond, a necessary part of the educational process. He conveniently ignores the fact that his educational interest will evaporate the moment the boy grows a beard. He frames the gifts not as payments, but as gestures of magnanimity, tokens of his benevolent patronage. He is not a John, he is a philanthropist of the flesh. Now let's tune into the boy's internal monologue. It's a much more chaotic and desperate frequency. He has to rationalize his own submission. "This is my duty," he repeats to himself, a mantra against the rising tide of panic. "My father wishes it. The city expects it. This is how I will gain honor. This is the price of a future." He clings to the language of virtue that has been fed to him. He tries to see his mentor not as an old man with sweaty hands, but as a font of wisdom. He tries to interpret the clumsy fumbling as a form of paternal affection. He has to believe the lie because the alternative, that he is simply a piece of meat being traded for social advantage, is too devastating to contemplate. He engages in a form of willed disassociation. The boy who endures the encounter is not the real him. The real him is the future statesman, the future general, the respected head of a household. This is just a temporary, unpleasant role he has to play. He compartmentalizes the shame, packing it away in a dark corner of his mind, hoping it won't leak out and poison the rest of his life. He rationalizes his fear as a form of virtuous modesty. His trembling is not terror, It is a sign of his chastity. His silence is not helplessness, it is a mark of his respectful deference. He recasts his own trauma as a performance of moral purity, the only way to survive with a shred of self-worth intact. This internal world, this toxic stew of bad faith, folk science, and desperate rationalization, was the invisible engine driving the entire system. It allowed good men to act like monsters and innocent boys to participate in their own defilement. It was a shared delusion, a collective agreement to misinterpret reality in a way that served the interests of power. The real filth wasn't on the floor of the andron, it was in the carefully constructed lies they told themselves in the quiet of their own minds. The wine has been poured, the poetry recited, the justifications rehearsed. The air in the andron is thick with anticipation and the smell of impending compromise. Now comes the moment the entire evening has been building towards, the first point of contact. This is not the graceful, choreographed seduction of myth. This is the initial shock, the clumsy, jarring collision of theory and reality. It's the moment the philosophical pretense evaporates, leaving behind the stark, awkward truth of flesh and power. The scene is chaotic. The party is in full swing. Men are shouting over each other, telling loud, boastful stories. The aulos player is squeezing out a shrill, frantic melody. Slaves are scurrying back and forth, refilling cups and clearing away discarded bones. In the midst of this contrived revelry, the Erastes makes his move. He has been watching the boy, his eromenos, who sits nervously at the edge of the couch, trying to look both attentive and aloof, just as his father instructed. The man has had just enough watered-down wine to feel bold, but not so much that he's lost his strategic cunning. He slides closer on the lumpy cushion, his thigh pressing against the boy's. The contact is electric, a jolt of unwelcome intimacy. The boy flinches, a tiny, involuntary recoil. This is it. The abstract concept of courtship has just become a very real, very warm pressure against his leg. The Erastes pretends not to notice the flinch. He leans in close, his breath a foul wave of wine, garlic, and old man's smell. He doesn't go for a kiss or a direct grope. Not yet. That would be too crass, too much like the work of a common prostitute's client. Instead, he begins his verbal assault, cloaked in the language of philosophy. "Tell me, Lycomedes," he might whisper, his voice a conspiratorial rumble. "What are your thoughts on Alcibiades' argument about the nature of the soul?" The boy's mind goes blank. He has no thoughts on Alcibiades. His only thought is of the heavy, sweating thigh pressed against his own and the scratchy wool of the man's tunic against his arm. He mumbles something incoherent, a half-remembered line from his tutor. He looks down, just as his father told him to. Humility, deference. The man chuckles, a low, patronizing sound. A modest soul, a fine thing in a youth. His hand, which has been resting on the couch behind the boy, now moves to the boy's shoulder. The touch is meant to be paternal, reassuring, but his fingers are thick and heavy and they squeeze just a little too hard. It's a touch of ownership. It says, "You are mine." The boy freezes. Every muscle in his body tenses. This is the point of no return. He can't pull away without causing a scene, without insulting this powerful man and shaming his family. He is trapped by etiquette, pinned down by the unspoken rules of the game. He can feel the eyes of the other men in the room on them. They are not staring overtly, but he can feel their peripheral glances, their knowing smirks. His humiliation is part of the evening's entertainment. The Erastes, emboldened by the boy's lack of resistance, escalates. His hand slides from the shoulder down the boy's back, a slow, deliberate journey over the thin fabric of his chiton. The boy can feel every knuckle, every callus on the man's fingers. It feels like a spider crawling down his spine. The man continues to whisper philosophical nothings in his ear, his words a meaningless drone against the roaring in the boy's head. The contrast is sickening, the lofty, abstract language of the soul paired with the crude, invasive reality of the touch. All the illusions of control the boy might have clung to are now shattered. He is not a participant in a witty dialogue, he is a passive object in someone else's script. His carefully rehearsed lines, his coached gestures of reluctance, they all feel pathetic and useless now. The reality of the situation is far more blunt and physical than he could have imagined. This isn't a dance, it's a slow-motion ambush. The initial shock is not one of violence, but of profound awkwardness and violation. It's the shock of realizing that your body is no longer your own sovereign territory. It has been claimed, and the invasion is being conducted under the guise of polite conversation. The man might then try to feed the boy a morsel of food from his own hand, a fig, perhaps, sticky with honey. This act, seemingly one of tenderness, is another power play. To accept the food is to accept a form of submission, to be fed like a pet or a child. To refuse is an insult. The boy, caught in this impossible bind, opens his mouth. The man's fingers brush against his lips, and the boy has to fight the urge to gag. The shock is also sensory. The man is too close. His smell is overwhelming. His touch is clammy. The sounds of the party, which a moment ago were a chaotic background noise, now seem to fade, replaced by the sound of his own heart pounding in his ears. The world shrinks to the space of this single, suffocating couch. He is acutely aware of every detail, the way the man's beard scratches his cheek, the slight tremor in the man's hand that betrays his own nervousness, the wine stain on his tunic. This is the moment the beautiful abstract painting of Greek love is slashed to ribbons by the clumsy knife of reality. There is no poetry here. There is only a frightened boy and a predatory man, both performing their prescribed roles in a ritual that is at once deeply personal and brutally public. The first point of contact is a plunge into cold water. It's the sickening lurch in the stomach when the intellectual game becomes a physical one. All the preparation, all the justification falls away, and what's left is the raw, undeniable fact of one body imposing its will upon another. It is chaotic, clumsy, and utterly devoid of the grace and nobility they pretend to celebrate. It is the beginning of the end of the boy's childhood, and it happens not with a bang, but with a sweaty, wine-scented whisper. The initial shock has landed, the philosophical veil is torn. What follows is not a swift conclusion, but a prolonged, grinding ordeal. This is the midpoint slog, the long, messy, and deeply intimate chaos of the relationship itself. The mentorship moves beyond the symposium and seeps into the daily life of the boy, a constant, low-grade infection of the soul. This is not about a single, dramatic moment of seduction. It's about the sustained, repetitive horror of the mundane. The lessons continue, but they are now a thinly veiled excuse for assignations. The Erastes might invite the boy to his home to study rhetoric or discuss philosophy. These sessions take place in a quiet room, away from the prying eyes of the main household. The setting is intimate, but the feeling is clinical. A scroll of Homer might lie open on a table, a prop to maintain the fiction, but it is never read. The real lesson is one of compliance. The encounters are rarely the passionate cinematic events we might imagine. They are often fumbling, awkward, and profoundly unerotic. Remember, the Erastes is not a young athletic lover. He is a middle-aged man, often out of shape, his body a landscape of sagging flesh and encroaching decay. The boy is not a willing, eager partner. He is a terrified adolescent going through the motions out of a sense of duty and fear. The physical act itself becomes a mechanical process, a box to be checked on the list of contractual obligations. We must get close here into the grim anatomical details, because that is where the true horror lies. Picture the scene. A small, stuffy room. The air is still and heavy. The boy lies on a couch, his eyes fixed on a crack in the ceiling, trying to transport his mind somewhere else. He focuses on the sound of a dog barking outside, on the smell of baking bread from a neighbor's house, on anything but the weight of the man on top of him. He learns to disassociate, to turn his body into an object, a vessel to be used. The man's breathing is heavy, labored. His sweat, smelling of stale wine and anxiety, drips onto the boy's face. The physical intimacy is grotesque, a parody of love. There is no tenderness, only a grim, goal-oriented urgency. The man whispers what he thinks are words of endearment, but they sound like the grunts of an animal. He might call the boy my little owl or my golden sparrow, pathetic attempts to inject poetry into a situation that is utterly devoid of it. The boy remains silent, his passivity mistaken for consent, or even better, for virtuous maidenly submission. This slog is not just about the physical encounters, it's about the psychological grind. The boy must be constantly available. The Erastes might summon him at any time, expecting him to drop his studies or his games with friends to attend to his duties. The boy's life is no longer his own. It is lived on his patron's schedule. He becomes a kind of high-class servant, his time and his body subject to the whims of another man. The gifts which seemed so grand at the beginning now feel like a salary for a job he hates. The fine cloak is warm, but it feels like a uniform. The fighting cockcrows in the morning, a shrill reminder of the price that was paid for it. Every object is tainted by the nature of the transaction. The relationship is a constant performance. In public, they must maintain the facade of the noble mentor and the adoring student. They walk together in the agora, the man pointing out important buildings and explaining their civic function, the boy listening with a look of rapt attention. It's a piece of theatre for the benefit of the public. But a single glance between them can betray the lie. A flicker of resentment in the boy's eyes, a flash of predatory ownership in the man's. They are bound together in a conspiracy of silence, each one playing his part. The emotional toll is immense. The boy is filled with a simmering rage he cannot express, a deep-seated shame that colors everything he does. He becomes cynical beyond his years. He learns that ideals are a sham, that virtue is a commodity, and that love is a euphemism for power. He sees the city's most respected men, the pillars of the community, and knows their dirty secrets. The world becomes a landscape of hypocrisy. He might develop a dark, morbid sense of humor as a coping mechanism, sharing cynical jokes with other boys in the same position, a gallows humor that is the only honest expression of their reality. And what of the Erastes? He is not immune to the grinding chaos. He may be consumed by jealousy, constantly watching the boy for any sign of interest in another man or, heaven forbid, a girl his own age. His love is possessive, suffocating. He demands total loyalty, not out of affection, but because the boy is a reflection of his own status. Any slight from the boy is a public humiliation. He might also be racked with a strange kind of guilt. He knows on some level that what he is doing is wrong, that the philosophical justifications are flimsy, but he is trapped by his own desires and the expectations of his social class. So he doubles down on the fiction, becoming even more overbearing in his role as mentor, his philosophical pronouncements growing more and more grandiose to drown out the voice of his own conscience. The midpoint slog is this slow, grinding erosion of the soul. It is the death of innocence by 1,000 small cuts. It's the daily humiliations, the forced smiles, the silent screams. It's the realization that this is not a temporary phase, but a long, grueling marathon of degradation. The real tragedy is not in the shock of the first touch, but in the mundane, repetitive nature of the violation, until it becomes a normal, accepted part of life. It's the process by which a human being is slowly, methodically hollowed out, leaving behind a compliant, beautifully decorated shell. This is the unpoetic truth of the educational bond, a long, slow, grinding descent into a shared hell of bad faith and silent resentment. No system built on such a rotten foundation can last forever. The entire enterprise of the Erastes and Eromenos relationship was a high-wire act, predicated on a delicate balance of age, beauty, and social status. It was destined to fall apart, and when it did, the end was rarely noble or poetic. It was usually humiliating, anticlimactic, and profoundly undignified. This is the inevitable downfall, the chapter where it all goes wrong. The most common and predictable cause of the relationship's demise was biology. For the Eromenos, time was the enemy. The entire value of the boy in this marketplace was his youth, his pre-pubescent smoothness, his budding nature. The first shadow of a beard on his chin was not a sign of manhood. It was a termination notice. It was the biological equivalent of a closing bell at the stock exchange. The Greeks were obsessed with this transition. They even had a specific term for the first downy hairs on the cheek, ianthos. The appearance of ianthos was the signal that the boy was no longer a boy. He was becoming a man and therefore no longer a suitable object for this specific type of desire. The Erastes, who continued a relationship with a bearded youth, was seen as pathetic and deviant, unable to play by the established rules. So imagine the boy's dawning horror. He wakes up one morning, splashes water on his face, and sees it, a few dark, stubborn hairs on his upper lip or jawline. He might try to pluck them, to shave them, to hold back the tide of his own maturation, but it's a losing battle. His body is betraying him, disqualifying him from the only game he's been taught to play. The downfall is swift. The Erastes, who just weeks before was whispering poetry and swearing undying affection, suddenly becomes distant. The invitations to study philosophy cease. The walks in the agora become less frequent. The man's gaze, once so intense, now slides past the boy, already scanning the gymnasia for a younger, smoother replacement. The end is rarely a formal breakup. There is no heartfelt conversation. It is a slow, cruel fade to black. The boy is simply dropped. He is left in a social and emotional no-man's land. He is too old to be a desirable Eromenos, but he is not yet established enough to be an Erastes. He has been used up and discarded like a piece of fruit that has started to rot. The humiliation is immense and very public. Everyone knows the rules. They see the boy walking alone. They see his former patron with a new, younger protégé, and they understand completely. The boy has been aged out of the system. He is yesterday's news. Another path to downfall was financial. The Erastes was a patron, and patronage costs money. The gifts, the connections, the support, it all depended on the man's wealth and influence. If the Erastes suffered a financial setback, a lost shipment at sea, a bad investment in a silver mine, a political fine, the first budget cut was often the boy. The stream of gifts would dry up. The promises of a military commission would evaporate. The man, consumed by his own problems, would have no time or resources for his beloved. This was a particularly brutal form of abandonment. The boy had fulfilled his end of the bargain, enduring the shame and the degradation, only to have the promised reward snatched away. He was left with nothing but the stain of the relationship. He had allowed himself to be used, all for a future that would never materialize. His father would be furious, not out of concern for his son's emotional well-being, but because the family's investment had failed to pay dividends. The boy was now a double failure, a used commodity with no payoff. Then there were the more dramatic, albeit less common, failures. The relationship could implode due to a breach of protocol. The boy, for instance, might be accused of accepting actual money for his favors. This would cross the invisible line between noble courtship and common prostitution, bringing ruinous shame upon both him and his lover. The distinction was, of course, entirely hypocritical. A gift of a horse was acceptable, but a bag of coins was a scandal. The scandal wasn't the sex. It was the lack of a sufficiently noble lie to cover it up. The boy could also bring about his own downfall by failing to perform his role correctly. If he seemed too eager, too willing, he would be branded as promiscuous and common. He would lose his mystique, his allure of chaste reluctance. The erasters would drop him, disgusted by his lack of virtue, the very virtue the man himself was trying to breach. It was an impossible catch-22. The boy had to yield, but he could never appear to want to. The entire system was a setup for failure. And what of the erastes? His downfall could be equally pathetic. He might become so obsessed with his eromenos that he neglects his wife, his business, his civic duties. He becomes a laughingstock, a man enslaved by his passion for a boy who is clearly just playing him for gifts. Or, as he ages, he might find himself unable to attract any desirable youths at all. His wealth wanes, his body decays, and he is left a lonely, bitter old man haunting the fringes of the gymnasium, a ghost of his former self. The end of these relationships was a monument to anticlimax. There was no tragic, romantic farewell. There was only the awkward silence of a contract expired, the shame of a bad investment, the quiet horror of being replaced. The system was designed to be a conveyor belt. Boys were brought on at one end, used for the duration of their fleeting beauty, and then unceremoniously dumped off the other end to make way for the next batch. The downfall was not a bug in the system, it was the system's primary feature. It was a built-in mechanism for ensuring a constant supply of fresh meat, a brutal testament to the fact that in this world, love was not timeless, but had a very specific and very cruel expiration date. The narrative of the passive, victimized boy is compelling, but it's not the whole story. To paint the eromenos as a completely helpless pawn is to deny him his humanity. Even within this deeply oppressive system, there were flashes of agency, moments of resistance, and desperate, often futile attempts to escape or subvert the rules. These small rebellions, though usually doomed to fail, are crucial because they reveal the cracks in the facade and the unquenchable human desire for dignity, even in the most degrading of circumstances. The most common form of resistance was subtle, a kind of low-level sabotage. A boy who particularly despised his patron might become a master of malicious compliance. He would do everything that was asked of him, but with a sullen, dead-eyed indifference that sucked all the pleasure and ego gratification out of it for the eraste. He would be physically present, but emotionally absent, turning the encounter into a joyless, mechanical act. It was a way of saying, "You can have my body, but you cannot have my spirit." This passive resistance could be remarkably effective. And Erastes sought not just physical release, but a validation of his own charm and power. A boy who refused to provide that validation, who made the man feel pathetic and unwanted even in the act of submission, was wielding a powerful psychological weapon. Another form of resistance was small-scale theft. The boy might pocket a few loose coins left on a table or sneak away a small, valuable object, a silver cup, a finely carved comb. This wasn't just about the monetary value. It was an act of reclamation, a way of taking back a small piece of what he felt he was owed. It was a secret tax levied on his own humiliation. He was being used as a commodity, so why not engage in a little unauthorized commerce of his own? It was a way of reframing the relationship in his own mind from one of pure exploitation to one of risky but empowering thievery. Then there were the more direct, and therefore more dangerous, acts of defiance. A boy might talk back. He might challenge his mentor's philosophical pronouncements or openly mock his poetry. This was a high-stakes gamble. It could backfire spectacularly, resulting in him being beaten or, worse, publicly shamed and discarded. But if the boy was particularly clever or beautiful, and the Erastes particularly infatuated, it could work. He could carve out a small space of intellectual autonomy, forcing the man to treat him less like a pet and more like a peer. This was a way of fighting back on the very territory the Erastes claimed as his own, the world of wit and rhetoric. There were also attempts at escape, though these were almost always tragic. A boy might try to run away, to leave Athens and start a new life elsewhere. But where could he go? A lone teenage boy with no money and no connections was easy prey. He would likely end up captured and sold into actual slavery, or fall into the hands of criminals. The system he was fleeing from was, ironically, the only thing providing him with any kind of protection. More common than a physical escape was an emotional one. A boy might fall in love with someone his own age, a girl or another boy, in secret. This was the ultimate act of rebellion. It was a declaration that his heart was not for sale. These secret relationships were fraught with peril. If the Erastes found out, his jealousy would be volcanic. He would see it as the ultimate betrayal, a theft of the emotional loyalty he believed he had purchased. The consequences could be dire, not just for the Eromenos, but for his secret lover as well. Yet these relationships happened. They were a testament to the fact that real, genuine affection could blossom even in the most poisoned soil. They were small, flickering candles of warmth in the cold, transactional darkness. We can also see resistance in the moments when the professional mask slipped. An Eromenos, after months or years of silent endurance, might finally crack. He might burst into tears or lash out in a fit of rage, screaming all the things he had been forced to hold inside. These emotional explosions were terrifying for the Erastes. They shattered the comfortable fiction of the willing student. They forced the man to confront the raw, ugly reality of the boy's suffering. For a moment, the power dynamic was inverted. The boy, in his raw pain, was in control, and the man, faced with the consequences of his actions, was helpless and exposed. These moments of resistance were often failures in the practical sense. The thieving boy might get caught, the defiant boy might get discarded, the escaping boy might get dragged back. But they were not failures in the spiritual sense. They were assertions of selfhood. They were proof that even when stripped of power, choice, and dignity, the human spirit retains the capacity to say no, even if only in a whisper. They highlight the tragedy of the system even more acutely. These boys were not just passive victims, they were active participants in their own survival, using every tool at their disposal, wit, silence, theft, and love, to navigate a world designed to break them. Their failed escapes and small rebellions are not just footnotes, they are the heart of the story. They are the proof that underneath the veneer of philosophical bullshit, there was a real, breathing, fighting human being who refused to be completely erased. Just when you think this system couldn't get any more fraught with anxiety and degradation, history has a tendency to throw in a wild card, an escalating factor that turns an already grim situation into a full-blown nightmare. The relationship between an Erastes and an Eromenos was a fragile ecosystem, and it didn't take much to send it spiraling into a new dimension of weirdness, violence, or public humiliation. One of the most common and volatile wildcards was the arrival of a rival. A particularly beautiful or well-connected boy would often attract the attention of more than one powerful man. This would transform the noble courtship into a vicious, high-stakes bidding war. The rivals, the Anterastai, would compete to see who could offer the most extravagant gifts, the most impressive connections, the most flowery poetry. The boy suddenly found himself at the center of a toxic vortex of male ego. On the surface, this might seem like a good thing for him. His market value was soaring. He was the prize. But the reality was terrifying. He was no longer just a passive object of one man's desire. He was the battlefield upon which two powerful men fought for dominance. The pressure on him intensified tenfold. He had to play them off against each other without angering either one. A misstep could result in him losing both patrons and being labeled a manipulative tease. The rivals might try to slander each other, spreading rumors about their opponent's stinginess, impotence, or bad breath. The boy would be caught in the middle, forced to listen to this litany of insults, all while maintaining a facade of innocent neutrality. The competition could even escalate to physical violence. It was not unheard of for rivals to come to blows at a symposium, brawling over the right to court a particular youth. The boy would have to watch as these supposedly dignified philosophical men devolved into drunken thugs, fighting over him as if he were a scrap of meat. This turned his life into a constant source of public drama and spectacle, amplifying his shame and objectification to an unbearable degree. Another devastating wildcard was the intervention of the Erastes' wife. We often forget she existed, a silent, shadowy figure in the background. But Athenian wives were not always passive victims of their husbands' affairs. A powerful, well-connected wife from a wealthy family was not someone to be trifled with. If she felt her position, or her family's honor, was being threatened by her husband's obsession with a boy, she could make his life hell. Imagine the scene. The Erastes is in his study, mentoring his young charge, when the door bursts open and his wife appears. She doesn't scream or cry. She is a picture of cold, aristocratic fury. She doesn't address the boy. He is beneath her notice. She directs her venom at her husband, her words dripping with sarcasm and contempt. She might mock his age, his waning virility, his pathetic attempts to recapture his youth. She might threaten to return to her father's house, a move that would cause a massive social and financial scandal. The husband is utterly humiliated, his authority and masculine pride shredded in front of his eromenos. The boy, in turn, is caught in the crossfire of a domestic war he wants no part of. He sees the powerful man he is supposed to admire reduced to a stammering, emasculated husband. The entire power dynamic is violently upended, exposing the rickety foundations of the man's authority. The encounter ends in shame and chaos, and the boy is likely to be discarded as the source of the trouble. Then there's the wild card of a public accusation. As we've discussed, the line between acceptable gifting and illegal prostitution was dangerously thin. All it took was one enemy, one rival, one disgruntled former lover to make a public accusation. The boy and his patron could be dragged into court. The trial would be a spectacle of public humiliation. Every intimate detail of their relationship would be picked apart by lawyers, scrutinized by a jury of their peers. The gifts would be presented as evidence of payment. The boy would be forced to testify, his every word twisted. His virtuous reluctance would be painted as a whore's calculated ploy. His mentor's philosophical pronouncements would be exposed as the pathetic lies they were. Regardless of the verdict, their reputations would be ruined. The boy would be forever tainted by the scandal, his future prospects shattered. The man would become a social pariah, a symbol of elite hypocrisy. The wild card could also be a sudden, bizarre ritual or social trend. Athenian society was prone to fads and superstitions. A new religious cult might sweep through the city, preaching abstinence and condemning pederastic relationships. Suddenly the Erastes, who was once a celebrated man of taste, is now seen as a depraved sinner. Or a new philosophical school might emerge, arguing for a different model of education, making the traditional Erastes, eromenos, bond seem old-fashioned and crude. The very ground beneath their feet could shift, turning what was once an accepted norm into a source of shame and ridicule. These wildcards served to crank up the volume on an already unbearable situation. They introduced new layers of chaos, danger, and absurdity. They demonstrated that no one in this system was truly in control. The Erastes, for all his power, was vulnerable to rivals, wives, and public opinion. The boy, for all his passivity, could suddenly become the epicenter of a destructive social earthquake. The wild card was a reminder that this carefully constructed world of rules and roles was, at its heart, unstable, irrational, and always just one jealous rival or angry wife away from collapsing into utter, humiliating chaos. The party is over. The last drunken guest has stumbled home. The Aulos player has packed up her pipes. The symposium is finished, and so is the relationship. What remains is the aftermath, the quiet, grotesque landscape left behind after the main event. This is not about the grand sweeping consequences for society. We'll get to that. This is about the immediate personal fallout, the emotional and physical cleanup. The tone now is one of exhaustion and hollowness. For the boy, who has now aged out of the system, the end of the relationship brings a strange, hollow sort of freedom. The constant pressure is gone. He no longer has to perform to be on at all times. He can let his beard grow. He can speak his own mind without fear of displeasing his patron, but this freedom is tainted. It feels less like liberation and more like being laid off from a soul-crushing job. There is no severance package, only a profound sense of emptiness. He now has to face the world as a man, but his primary education in manhood was a twisted curriculum of submission and shame. The immediate aftermath is a period of awkward social navigation. He will inevitably run into his former erastes in the agora or at the gymnasium. These encounters are a masterclass in cringing discomfort. What do they say to each other? A polite, formal nod? A brief, meaningless exchange about the weather? Both men are intensely aware of the history between them, the shared intimacy and the shared lies. The space between them crackles with unspoken words. The boy might feel a surge of resentment, seeing the man who used and discarded him. The man might feel a twinge of guilt, or perhaps just the awkwardness of facing a past indiscretion. More likely, he will see the boy with his new beard and maturing frame and feel a faint sense of disgust, as if looking at a piece of fruit that has gone past its prime. The boy is a living reminder of the man's own aging process, and he would rather not be reminded. So the former beloved is often treated with a cool, polite distance. He is a ghost from a previous chapter, and the man has already started writing a new one with a younger, fresher protagonist. The cleanup is primarily emotional. The boy has to find a way to put on a new social face. He is now expected to transition seamlessly into the role of a respectable citizen. He must find a wife, start a family, and, in the cruelest irony of all, eventually become an erastes himself, perpetuating the very system that damaged him. He has to take all the trauma, all the humiliation, all the cynicism, and pack it away. He must perform the role of a well-adjusted man, a product of a noble and educational tradition. His entire society is complicit in this demand for amnesia. No one wants to hear about his pain or his anger. To speak of it would be to challenge the foundational myths of their culture, so he learns to be silent. His trauma becomes a private, festering wound, hidden beneath the carefully constructed armor of conventional manhood. The aftermath also involves a kind of psychological triage. The boy has to sort through the wreckage of his own identity. Who is he, now that he is no longer defined by his relationship with his patron? He might throw himself into military training or political life with a desperate intensity, trying to prove his manliness, to wash away the stain of his passive, feminine past. He might become hardened and cynical, his ability to trust or to love genuinely stunted. He sees all relationships through the lens of transaction and power, or he might become a bully, inflicting on others the same kind of humiliation he endured. The pain is not processed, it is simply passed on. And what of the physical landscape left behind? In the Andron, where the symposia took place, the morning after is a scene of minor devastation. Slaves move through the room, their faces grim and impassive. They are the silent cleaners of the elite's mess. They sweep up the food scraps, the broken pottery, the discarded garlands. They scrub the wine stains from the mosaic floor. They air out the lumpy, sweat-soaked cushions from the clean-eye. The room is being sanitized, its history erased, prepared for the next party, the next round of philosophical justifications and sordid transactions. The air, once thick with smoke and perfume and lies, is now stale and sour, smelling of regret and old wine. This physical cleanup is a perfect metaphor for the emotional cleanup demanded of the former Eromenos. Just as the slaves wipe the room clean, he is expected to wipe his memory clean. The evidence of the previous night's debauchery is removed, just as he is expected to remove all evidence of his own trauma. The entire system depends on this constant, meticulous process of sanitation and forgetting. The aftermath is not a resolution, it is a reset. The stage is cleared, the props are put away, and the actors are given new roles. The boy, now a man, is handed a new script, one that requires him to pretend that the previous act never happened. The hollowness he feels is the space where his authentic self used to be, a self that was sacrificed for the sake of a good education and a secure spot in the city's power structure. The silence that follows the end of the relationship is the most deafening sound of all. It is the sound of a conspiracy, a collective agreement to look away, to move on, and to pretend that nothing of consequence was lost. The immediate aftermath is a hollow silence, but the echoes of this experience linger for a lifetime. The wound, packed away and hidden from public view, does not heal. It festers. This is the lingering trauma, the long-term psychological scars that shaped the men who emerged from this system. The coping mechanisms they developed were often as damaging as the initial abuse, creating a cycle of emotional dysfunction that rippled through Athenian society. The most common and lasting scar was a profound and corrosive cynicism. A young man who has learned from an early age that love is a transaction, that virtue is a performance, and that powerful men are hypocrites, is unlikely to grow into a trusting and open-hearted adult. He has seen behind the curtain. He knows the machinery of society is lubricated with lies. This cynicism would infect every aspect of his life. In politics, he would see not civic duty, but a game of power and self-interest. In business, he would see not commerce, but a form of legalized theft. He would become a master of the double-edged compliment, the sarcastic remark, the knowing, weary smirk. His humor would be dark and biting, a shield against a world he knew to be fundamentally fraudulent. This was the dark gift of his education. He was inoculated against idealism forever. Another deep scar was a warped understanding of intimacy and relationships. His primary model for a close, emotional bond was one of power imbalance, coercion, and performance. How could a man who learned about love in such a context form a healthy, equitable relationship with a wife? His marriage would likely be a formal, distant affair, another transaction designed to produce legitimate heirs and secure family alliances. He might treat his wife with the same blend of condescension and ownership that his Erastes treated him with. He would be unable to see her as an equal partner, only as another piece of property, another role to be managed. The very concepts of tenderness, vulnerability, and mutual respect would be foreign to him, or worse, he would see them as signs of weakness. The trauma could also manifest as a kind of emotional numbness, a permanent state of disassociation. The boy who learned to go somewhere else in his head during the unwanted physical encounters might become a man who is permanently disconnected from his own feelings. He would go through the motions of life, grieving at funerals, celebrating at festivals, but feel nothing. He would be a spectator in his own life, his emotional core cauterized and deadened. This numbness was a survival mechanism. To feel the full weight of his past would be to shatter. So he built a wall around his heart, becoming a cold, efficient, and deeply lonely man. For some, the trauma would manifest as a compulsive need to reenact the past, but this time from a position of power. This is the most tragic outcome. The victim becomes the perpetrator. The former eromenos, now a grown man, becomes an erastes. He haunts the gymnasia, his eyes scanning the crowds of young boys looking for a beautiful youth to mentor. He is not just seeking pleasure or status. He is seeking a form of psychological revenge. He is unconsciously trying to undo his own trauma by inflicting it on someone else. In the submissive, frightened eyes of his own eromenos, he sees a reflection of his younger self. By controlling and dominating this boy, he feels a fleeting, illusory sense of mastery over his own past. He whispers the same philosophical lies that were whispered to him. He offers the same transactional gifts. He perpetuates the cycle of abuse not out of malice but out of a desperate, misguided attempt to heal himself. This is the grim inheritance of the system. It doesn't just create traumatized individuals, it creates the next generation of abusers. The coping mechanisms were varied. Some might turn to excessive drinking, using the oblivion of the symposium to quiet the ghosts of the past. Some might develop a raging temper, their unexpressed anger and shame lashing out at slaves, wives, or anyone in a weaker position. Some might become obsessed with their public image, constantly striving for honors and recognition, as if a pile of accolades could fill the hollow space inside them. The dark humor they shared with their peers was another crucial coping tool. In the locker rooms of the gymnasium or over wine at a private dinner, these men, who were all alumni of the same brutal school, might share cynical stories and jokes about their experiences. They would mock their former patrons, compare notes on their techniques of manipulation, and laugh about the absurdity of it all. This gallows humor was a way of processing the trauma, of turning a private shame into a shared, communal experience. It was a way of saying, we all went through this. We all survived. We know the truth. But the laughter was always brittle, always tinged with bitterness. It was the laughter of men who had learned the world's dirtiest joke at a very young age. The psychological scars of this system were not just individual tragedies. They were a fundamental part of the Athenian male psyche. The city-state that prided itself on logic, reason, and democracy was built on a foundation of ritualized trauma and emotional dysfunction. The men who debated in the assembly, who led armies into battle, who wrote the laws and the philosophy that we still study today, were carrying these invisible wounds. Their public greatness was inextricably linked to a private, festering rottenness, a legacy of shame and cynicism that they could never fully escape. The personal traumas of these men, multiplied by thousands and repeated over generations, did not remain contained within their individual psyches. They bled out, seeping into the very fabric of Athenian society, creating a city that was brilliant and innovative on the surface, but deeply diseased at its core. The societal ripple effect of this institutionalized exploitation was profound and far-reaching, affecting public health, the economy, the legal system, and the fate of future generations. The most immediate and visceral ripple effect was a public health crisis. In an age before antibiotics, sexually transmitted diseases were rampant, terrifying, and often deadly. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other infections spread like wildfire through the intimate networks created by these relationships. The Greeks had no concept of germ theory. They attributed these illnesses to divine punishment, miasma, or an imbalance of the humors. The cures were often as horrific as the diseases themselves. A man suffering from the telltale sores and discharges might turn to a quack doctor, a leeching priest who would prescribe useless and painful treatments. Mercury was a common remedy, applied as an ointment or even ingested, leading to a slow, agonizing death from heavy metal poisoning. The city was filled with men, young and old, who were slowly rotting from the inside out, their bodies a testament to the dangers of a sexual culture divorced from any concept of hygiene or consent. This widespread disease had a chilling effect on the society's view of intimacy, further associating physical love with corruption, danger, and decay. The economic impact was also significant. The entire system was a shadow economy, a massive, unregulated market of gifts and favors that ran parallel to the official commerce of the city. The brothel, with its explicit cash for sex transactions, was a central business in the port of Piraeus, but the elite pederastic system was, in its own way, a much larger and more influential economic force. A huge amount of wealth was funneled from older, established families to the families of promising young boys. This wasn't just about the occasional gift of a cloak or a horse, it was about securing long-term financial and political advantages. The love of a powerful man was the ancient Greek equivalent of a venture capital investment. This created a closed loop of wealth and power. Only the rich could afford to be proper erastai, and their patronage ensured that the boys they chose, who were almost always from their own social class, would also become wealthy and powerful. It was a system that reinforced the existing class structure, making social mobility for those outside the elite circle nearly impossible. The city's economy was, in part, fueled by this trade in flesh and influence, a grimy engine of inequality hidden beneath a veneer of mentorship. This led, inevitably, to legal and social battles. The ambiguous laws surrounding these relationships were a constant source of litigation and political maneuvering. A man could use an accusation of prostitution to ruin a political rival. Court cases, like the famous one against a man named Timarchus, became public spectacles, laying bare the hypocrisy of the elite. These trials were not about protecting youths, they were about weaponizing sexual morality for political gain. In response to the growing chaos and scandal, social crusades would periodically erupt. Philosophers like Plato would write idealized, sanitized versions of these relationships, attempting to reform them into a purely intellectual and spiritual pursuit. Religious reformers would call for a return to a more virtuous time, condemning the city's moral laxity. These crusades were rarely successful. The system was too deeply entrenched, too closely tied to the structures of power and ambition. The laws might be tinkered with, the public rhetoric might shift, but the fundamental transaction remained the same. Perhaps the most tragic ripple effect was the fate of the next generation, particularly the children born from these encounters. While the focus was on the relationship between men and boys, the erastai were also married and had children with their wives. What kind of fathers did these emotionally damaged men make? Distant? Tyrannical? They would pass on their own warped understanding of love and power to their sons, preparing them for the same cycle of exploitation. And what of the children born outside of this system, the bastard children of prostitutes, or the unwanted offspring of affairs? They were the ultimate casualties. These children had no legal rights, no inheritance, no place in society. They were often abandoned at birth, left on a hillside to die of exposure, or to be picked up by slave traders. The lucky ones might end up in a rudimentary orphanage, but they would forever carry the stigma of their birth. They were a living, breathing testament to the society's failures, a generation of forgotten children who paid the ultimate price for the sexual hypocrisy of their fathers. The entire society was caught in this toxic feedback loop. The sexual exploitation created traumatized men, who in turn created a dysfunctional society, which then created more laws, scandals, and outcasts. It was a city at war with itself, its public ideals of democracy and reason constantly undermined by the private reality of abuse and exploitation. The grand monuments of Athens, the Parthenon, and the Erechtheion were built by a society that was, in many ways, profoundly sick, its foundations riddled with the rot of a deeply immoral and unsustainable social practice. So if the reality was this sordid, this abusive, this psychologically devastating, how on earth did we end up with the romantic, sanitized myth? How did a system of transactional exploitation get rebranded as platonic love? The answer lies in one of history's most successful and bitterest cons, the deliberate act of rewriting the past. The legacy of Greek pederasty is not just the trauma it caused, but the beautiful, intricate lie that was constructed to cover it up. This is the story of how filth was laundered into philosophy. The first and most influential spin doctors were the philosophers themselves, particularly Plato. Plato was not a naive idealist. He was a brilliant social critic who was deeply troubled by the crass, transactional nature of the relationships he saw around him. In works like the Symposium and the Phaedrus, he didn't just describe the system, he tried to sublimate it. He took the raw, ugly reality of the Erastes and Eromenos bond and attempted to elevate it into a ladder of love. In his idealized version, the physical desire for a beautiful boy was merely the first, lowest rung. A true philosopher, a true lover of wisdom, would use that initial physical attraction as a catalyst to ascend to higher, purer forms of love. The love of all beautiful bodies, then the love of beautiful souls, the love of beautiful laws and institutions, and finally, the ultimate ecstatic contemplation of the form of beauty itself. It was a brilliant, breathtaking intellectual maneuver. He wasn't denying the sexual component. He was reframing it as a necessary but primitive starting point, something to be transcended. He was essentially telling his fellow Athenian elites, you can keep your desire for boys, but only if you use it for a higher philosophical purpose. Stop being vulgar pigs and start being proper soul mentors. He was trying to reform the system from within, to replace the grubby transactions with a noble, spiritual quest. But in doing so, he created the perfect alibi. He gave future generations the philosophical language to talk about these relationships without ever having to confront their ugly reality. He handed them the "it's not about sex, it's about the soul" excuse on a silver platter. The next stage in this great historical cover-up came centuries later, with the Romans. The Romans were both fascinated and repulsed by Greek culture. They adopted Greek art, philosophy, and literature, but they were deeply suspicious of the pederastic tradition, which they saw as decadent and un-Roman. So, as they translated and absorbed Greek texts, they often downplayed or censored the more explicit aspects of these relationships. They focused on the military and civic aspects of the mentorship, conveniently ignoring the squalid sexual politics behind it. The process of sanitization continued through the early Christian era, when the celebration of the body was replaced by a deep-seated fear of the flesh. Anything that smacked of unnatural lust was condemned as a damnable sin. The rich, complex world of Greek sexuality was flattened into a simple binary of good and evil. The entire tradition was either ignored or vilified. But the final, and perhaps most effective, act of historical rewriting came in the 19th century. Victorian scholars, with their starched collars and deeply repressed sexual anxieties, rediscovered the classical world. They fell in love with Greek democracy, art, and philosophy. But they had a major PR problem. What to do about all the boy love? They couldn't just ignore it. It was right there in Plato, in the poetry, on the vases. So they performed a masterful feat of intellectual gymnastics. They invented the concept of platonic love, as we know it today, a purely spiritual, non-sexual affection. They took Plato's ladder of love and sawed off the bottom rung. They argued that the relationships between men and boys in ancient Athens were chaste, pure friendships, a meeting of noble minds. They willfully misinterpreted the evidence, ignored the graphic pottery, and explained away the explicit poetry as metaphorical. They projected their own era's rigid Christian morality and obsession with chastity back onto the ancient world. It was a deliberate, conscious act of historical whitewashing. They needed a version of ancient Greece that was worthy of their admiration, a Greece that could serve as a model for their own empire. A pederastic, abusive Greece did not fit that model, so they created a new one, a fantasy world of chaste philosophers and their adoring but untouched pupils. This is the version that has been passed down to us, the version that still shapes our pop culture understanding of the ancient world. We have inherited this lie. We have been taught to see the Parthenon and think of democracy, not of the institutionalized abuse that funded it. We have been taught to read Plato and think of pure ideas, not of the sordid human relationships he was trying to clean up. The bitter legacy of this system is not just the damage it did to countless boys, but the success of the cover story. The reality of the exploitation, the shame, the transaction, the trauma, all of it was buried under a mountain of beautiful, philosophical lies. History, as they say, is written by the victors, and in this case the victors were the ones who held the pen, the ones who had the power to turn a story of abuse into a timeless romance. The con was so successful we're still falling for it. We've journeyed through the filth and the hypocrisy, from the anxious preparations to the inevitable, undignified end. We've seen how a system of transactional abuse was painstakingly laundered over centuries, scrubbed clean of its shame and repackaged as a noble, philosophical ideal. The brutal reality of a boy's body being the price of his family's ambition was transformed into the romantic myth of platonic love, a mentorship of the soul. They took a story about power and exploitation and sold it as a story about beauty and wisdom. It was the greatest public relations campaign in the history of perversion. But here's the final bleak punchline. Don't get too comfortable on your moral high horse, looking back with 21st century judgment at those depraved, toga-wearing ancients. The mechanics of their system are not some dusty relic of the past. The fundamental transaction, the trading of youth, beauty, and ambition for access, power, and security, is still the bedrock of our own, supposedly more enlightened, world. We just use different language to justify it. We've simply swapped out the Erastes and the Eromenos for new roles with new titles, but the script is eerily the same. Think of the modern sugar daddy or sugar baby relationship, a phenomenon we discuss with a wink and a nudge. It's framed in the language of mutually beneficial arrangements and sponsorship. The older, wealthy benefactor isn't a predator. He's a mentor helping a young, ambitious person get their start. The young person isn't a prostitute. They are a companion, offering their time and their beauty in exchange for tuition, rent, or a foothold in a competitive industry. We've replaced the gift of a fighting cock with a Chanel bag and a trip to Dubai, but is the underlying exchange really any different? We are still monetizing youth, still trading flesh for a future. Or look at the world of unpaid internships, a rite of passage for the young and ambitious. A corporation, the modern Erastes, demands months of free labor from a young person, the modern Eromenos, in exchange for experience and connections. The young person, often deep in debt and desperate for a future, submits to this exploitation, hoping it will be the first rung on the ladder to a successful career. They are told it's an honor, a privilege to work for free for such a prestigious entity. It's not abuse, it's an opportunity. But the power imbalance is absolute, the promise of future reward is often illusory, and the entire system is designed to benefit the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. It's the same old story, just stripped of the poetry and conducted in a boardroom instead of a symposium. The core dynamic is immortal, the powerful promising access to the powerless in exchange for something the powerless possess in abundance: time, energy, youth, and a willingness to be used. We have perfected the art of disguising exploitation as opportunity. We sell it as mentorship, networking, career development, or even empowerment. We've built an entire global economy on the principle of dangling a brighter future in front of those who are desperate and then extracting from them whatever we can get in the present. So, as you sit there in your clean, modern surroundings, having consumed this story of ancient filth, ask yourself this: what comfortable lies are you telling yourself? What transactions in your own life or in the society around you are being whitewashed with the language of opportunity, mentorship, or mutual benefit? We look back at the Greeks and see their hypocrisy with perfect clarity. But can we see our own? Or are we too just getting high on the fumes of our own sophisticated justifications, whispering sweet nothings about the soul while we trade bodies for power?